Hello, my friend, and welcome. Tonight we journey back 8 centuries into an age of iron and faith, of burning deserts and rising floodwaters, of kings and cardinals, of sultan and soldier, of ambition crushed beneath the weight of history. We travel to a world where the cross and the crescent clashed not merely on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power, in the tents of command, in the hearts of ordinary men who marched thousands of miles in the hope of salvation, their own, and that of a holy city they had never seen. This is the story of the Fifth Crusade. It is a story that begins with a prayer and ends with a retreat. It is a story of the greatest military opportunity the Crusaders ever squandered, of a prize, the city of Damietta, won with extraordinary valor, and then traded away for promises that turned to dust in the Egyptian sun. It is a story of a remarkable sultan who offered peace again and again, and of a papal legate so consumed by divine certainty that he could not bring himself to accept it. It is a story of floods and famine, of disease and desertion, of hope prolonged past reason, and then abandoned past redemption. Sit with me now as we open the great book of medieval history, and let us read together, chapter by chapter, the full and extraordinary tale of the Fifth Crusade. Chapter 1. The World on the Eve of the Fifth Crusade. To understand why the Fifth Crusade happened, we must first understand the world that made it inevitable. By the early 13th century, the crusading movement was already more than 100 years old. It had begun in 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd at Clermont in France and called upon the knights of Christendom to march east, to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim rule, to take up the cross as a weapon of God and reclaim Jerusalem, the city where Christ had walked, wept, and died. The response had been extraordinary, almost incomprehensible by modern standards. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children, nobles and peasants, priests and merchants, the devout and the desperate had answered that call. They had marched across Europe and into Anatolia, across burning plains and jagged mountains, through starvation and slaughter, and in 1099, against almost all reasonable expectation, they had taken Jerusalem. The First Crusade had been a triumph of wild, chaotic, almost accidental success. It had established 4 Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These fragile Christian enclaves clung to the Levanten coast like lichen on a cliff face, always threatened, always dependent on fresh support from Europe, always one catastrophic defeat away from oblivion. That catastrophic defeat had come in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, when the great Muslim Sultan Saladin had destroyed the army of Jerusalem in a single afternoon on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Within months, Saladin had swept through the Holy Land, taking city after city, and on October 2, 1187, the anniversary, according to the Islamic calendar, of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, he had entered Jerusalem. The Christian kingdom, barely 90 years old, lay in ruins. Europe had reacted with horror and grief. The Third Crusade had followed, led by 3 of the greatest kings of the age: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, whose name would echo through the centuries as the archetype of the crusading warrior king. Frederick had drowned crossing a river in Anatolia. Philip had quarreled with Richard and gone home early. But Richard had fought Saladin to a standstill along the Palestinian coast, recapturing the port of Acre and several other cities. He had come within sight of Jerusalem twice, and twice he had turned back, recognizing that even if he could take it, he could not hold it. In 1192, he had signed a treaty with Saladin, a 3-year truce, access for Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem, and the retention of a coastal strip from Acre to Jaffa. It was a negotiated peace, not a triumph, and the memory of Jerusalem, lost, unreclaimed, yearned for, continued to haunt the Christian world. Saladin had died in 1193, his great empire fragmenting among his sons and brothers. The Ayyubid dynasty he had founded, named for his father Ayyub, would continue to govern Egypt and Syria, but it would do so in a state of constant internal tension, its various branches competing for power, forming and breaking alliances with dizzying speed. This fragmentation would prove both a danger and an opportunity for the Crusaders in the years to come. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, had been perhaps the most catastrophic and shameful episode in the entire crusading story. Originally intended to strike at Egypt, the heart of Ayyubid power, it had been derailed almost from the beginning by debt, politics, and the ruthless commercial calculations of Venice. It had ended not in the Holy Land but in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the great Christian city of the East, which the Crusaders had sacked in 1204 with a ferocity that shocked even their contemporaries. Churches were looted, relics were stolen, women were raped. The ancient treasures of the Roman world were carted off to the west. The Byzantine Empire was replaced by a Latin Empire, which would stagger on until 1261, universally despised and strategically useless. The Fourth Crusade had not liberated Jerusalem. It had divided Christendom, alienated the Greeks, strengthened the hand of Islam, and left a stain on the crusading ideal that would never entirely fade. And yet the ideal persisted. It persisted because it was rooted in something deeper than politics or strategy, in the profound medieval conviction that the Holy Land was the patrimony of Christ, that Jerusalem was the center of the world, that to allow it to remain in Muslim hands was a wound in the body of Christendom that could never be allowed to heal over. Every pope of the 13th century felt this obligation. Every generation of European knights was raised on its imagery. The cross continued to draw men eastward, even as crusade after crusade ended in failure, compromise, or disgrace. The man who would now take up this torch was the greatest pope of the medieval church, Innocent III. Innocent III had become pope in 1198 at the astonishing age of 37. He was brilliant, energetic, legally trained, theologically sophisticated, and possessed of a vision of papal authority so expansive that he genuinely believed the Pope to be the vicar of Christ, not merely the leader of the Church, but the supreme authority over all of Christendom, secular and spiritual alike. He had spent the first years of his pontificate consolidating that authority, intervening in the succession disputes of the Holy Roman Empire, maneuvering among the kings of Europe, launching the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heretics of southern France. But the liberation of Jerusalem remained his greatest ambition. He had called for a new crusade almost from the moment of his election. He had watched the Fourth Crusade veer catastrophically off course and had tried, with limited success, to bring it back to its proper purpose. Now, in the second decade of the 13th century, he was determined to try again, and this time he would ensure that the crusade was properly organized, properly financed, and properly led. In 1213, Innocent issued the bull Quia Maior, because it is greater, which called for a new crusade. It was the most elaborate crusade proclamation ever written, a detailed theological argument for why all Christians were obligated to participate, a comprehensive plan for preaching and recruitment across Europe, and a series of practical measures designed to avoid the disasters of previous crusades. It was followed in 1215 by the decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council, the greatest church council of the medieval period, which elaborated the logistical and financial framework for the new expedition. Innocent's plan was ambitious in every respect. The crusade would be financed partly by a special tax on the clergy, 1/20th of all ecclesiastical income for 3 years, and partly by the donations of the faithful, which would be solicited by an unprecedented preaching campaign across the whole of Latin Christendom. A network of trained preachers would carry the message from Iceland to Hungary, from Scotland to Sicily. The departure was set for June 1217, from the ports of southern Italy and Sicily. But Innocent would not live to see it. He died in July 1216 in Perugia, on his way to negotiate peace between the warring Italian city-states. He was 55 years old and had been pope for 18 years. He had shaped medieval Christianity more than almost any other individual, and his greatest project, the crusade that would redeem all the failures of the past, was about to begin without him. His successor, Honorius III, inherited the crusade along with the papacy. Honorius was older, less dynamic, more conciliatory than innocent, but he was no less committed to the cause. He would spend the next decade of his pontificate working, cajoling, pleading, threatening, and negotiating in its service. The great machine of crusade was in motion. The only question was whether it would work. Chapter 2. The Architects of Crusade Kings, Cardinals, and Commanders. Every crusade needed leaders, and the Fifth Crusade would be blessed, or perhaps cursed, with an unusually complicated command structure. The nominal leader of the expedition, at least in its early stages, was King Andrew II of Hungary. Andrew was a tall, heavy-set man in his mid-40s, a king who had spent most of his reign navigating the treacherous politics of Central Europe, fighting wars on multiple borders, and managing the powerful Hungarian nobility. He had been under obligation to go on crusade for years. His father, Bela III, had taken the cross on his deathbed and left the vow to Andrew as a sacred inheritance. The obligation had been deferred again and again by the press of domestic affairs, but by 1216 it could be deferred no longer. Andrew was accompanied by Duke Leopold VI of Austria, a younger and considerably more energetic ruler who would prove one of the more effective military commanders of the early crusade. Leopold was pious, capable, and genuinely motivated by crusading ideals. He had already made one pilgrimage to the Holy Land and was eager to do more. From the Crusader states themselves came a cast of characters shaped by a lifetime of frontier warfare. John of Brienne was the King of Jerusalem, a title that, by this point in history, carried more symbolic than territorial weight. John was a French knight of modest origins who had married Maria of Montferrat, the heiress to the kingdom, in 1210. Maria had died in 1212, and John governed as regent for their daughter Yolanda. He was a competent soldier and a determined ruler, but he was always aware that his claim to authority rested on marriage, not blood, and that the great lords of the kingdom did not always respect him as they should. There was also the military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, whose disciplined, professional soldiers would form the backbone of any crusading army. These orders had been founded to protect pilgrims and crusader territories, and they had evolved into formidable military institutions with houses across Europe, vast financial resources, and veteran warriors who had spent their entire adult lives fighting in the Holy Land. The masters of the Templars and Hospitallers would be key figures in the strategic debates of the Crusade. But the figure who would ultimately come to dominate the Fifth Crusade, and who bears the greatest historical responsibility for its outcome, was not a king or a military commander at all. He was a churchman, Pelagius of Albano. Pelagius was a Spanish cardinal, a man of fierce intelligence, absolute conviction, and almost complete inflexibility. He had been born in Portugal around 1165 and had risen through the church hierarchy on the strength of his legal training, his administrative competence, and his unswerving loyalty to the papacy. He had served as papal legate on several important missions, including a difficult assignment in Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade, and he had emerged from these experiences with an unshakable belief in papal authority and a corresponding contempt for the judgment of mere secular rulers. Honorius appointed Pelagius as the papal legate to the Fifth Crusade, the Pope's personal representative, with authority to make decisions in the Pope's name. This was a logical choice, given Pelagius's experience and his genuine personal commitment to the crusade. But it would have profound consequences for the way the crusade was conducted, because Pelagius was not a man who shared authority easily. He was certain of his own judgment and suspicious of the motives of others. He would interpret his legatine commission as giving him supreme authority over the entire crusading enterprise, authority that not all the secular leaders were willing to concede. The stage, then, was set for conflict, not between the Crusaders and their Muslim opponents, at least not initially, but between the different factions and personalities within the crusading army itself. There was also, hovering over everything, the question of the emperor. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was the most powerful secular ruler in the Western world, the King of Germany and Sicily, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts and mercurial personality who had taken the cross in 1215 with great ceremony and considerable popular enthusiasm. The Fifth Crusade was supposed to be Frederick's crusade, in the sense that the emperor's participation would give it a weight and credibility that no previous expedition had possessed. But Frederick kept finding reasons to delay his departure. There were always domestic problems to resolve first, political complications to untangle, plans to perfect. His absence would hang over the Fifth Crusade from beginning to end, a constant source of uncertainty, resentment, and false hope. Chapter 3. The Strategy of Egypt. Why Cairo, not Jerusalem? Before we follow the armies of the Fifth Crusade to their destination, we need to understand a strategic decision that had been forming in Crusader thinking for decades. The decision to attack Egypt rather than Palestine. On the surface, this seems counterintuitive. The Crusaders wanted Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in Palestine. Why would they sail to Egypt? The answer lies in the geopolitics of the Ayyubid Empire. Since the time of Saladin, Egypt had been the heart of Muslim power in the region. It was the wealthiest and most productive part of the Ayyubid domains. The Nile Valley was one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the world, capable of supporting a large population and generating enormous surplus revenues. Egypt's wealth funded the armies that held Syria and Palestine. Without Egypt, the Ayyubid sultans could not maintain their grip on Jerusalem. Conversely, if the Crusaders could capture Egypt, or even just its key port cities, they would have leverage. They could trade their Egyptian conquests for Jerusalem and the Holy Land, or they could hold Egypt as a base from which to conquer Palestine by land. Either way, Egypt was the key. This strategic logic had been recognized since at least the time of King Amalric I of Jerusalem in the 1160s, who had launched a series of campaigns into Egypt before Saladin forestalled him by seizing the country himself. Richard the Lionheart had understood it in the 1190s. Innocent III had understood it when planning the Fourth Crusade. Now, with the Fifth Crusade, it would be put into practice. The specific target would be Damietta, a large, wealthy city at the mouth of the easternmost branch of the Nile, in the Nile Delta. Damietta was the gateway to Egypt. It controlled trade, navigation, and military access to the interior of the country. If the Crusaders could take Damietta, the road to Cairo would be open. And if Cairo fell, all of Egypt would follow. It was a sound strategic concept. The question was whether it could be executed. The Ayyubid Sultan who would face this threat was Al-Adil I, known to the Crusaders as Safaddin, Saladin's brother, who had managed to consolidate control of the Ayyubid Empire after the chaos that had followed Saladin's death. Al-Adil was an old man by 1217. He was in his mid-70s, but he was experienced, shrewd, and had spent decades managing the political complexities of the Ayyubid world. He had actually spent time negotiating with Crusaders during the Third Crusade, and understood the Christian world in ways that many of his contemporaries did not. But Al-Adil would not be the Sultan who faced the Fifth Crusade at its height. He died in August 1218 and was succeeded by his son Al-Kamil, a man who would prove to be one of the most fascinating figures of the entire crusading era. Al-Kamil Muhammad was in his mid-30s when he became Sultan of Egypt. He was educated, sophisticated, and deeply interested in intellectual matters. He would later become famous for his long conversations with Francis of Assisi, who visited the Crusader camp as a peace emissary and was so charmed by the Sultan that he asked to remain at his court. Al-Kamil was a pragmatic ruler who understood that the Ayyubid Empire was most threatened not by Crusaders, but by its own internal divisions. He was genuinely willing to negotiate, genuinely willing to trade Jerusalem for peace, and would spend much of the Fifth Crusade trying and failing to make that trade. Chapter 4. The First Waves, ANDRW of Hungary and the Opening Campaign, 1217. The Fifth Crusade began not with a single great army but with a series of waves, contingents from different parts of Europe, arriving at different times, under different leaders, often with different priorities and expectations. The first significant force arrived in Acre in the late summer of 1217. King Andrew of Hungary had finally honored his vow and crossed the sea with a substantial army. By the standards of the time, an impressive force of Hungarian knights and infantry, accompanied by the contingents of Duke Leopold of Austria and other Central European nobles. Acre in 1217 was the capital of what remained of the Crusader kingdom, a bustling port city of extraordinary ethnic and commercial diversity, home to Italian merchants, Frankish knights, Syrian Christians, Jewish communities, and pilgrims from every corner of Europe. It was fortified, prosperous, and perpetually anxious, always aware of its vulnerability to the Muslim powers that surrounded it. The crusading leaders gathered there in the autumn of 1217 to plan their first campaign. The meeting was not entirely harmonious. Andrew of Hungary was the nominal commander, but the local barons of the Crusader kingdom had their own views on strategy, and the military orders pursued their own institutional priorities. There was also a fundamental disagreement about objectives. Should they march immediately on Egypt, as the grand strategy demanded, or should they first secure the position of the Crusader kingdom by conducting raids into the interior of Palestine? In the end, the 1217 campaign was a series of raids rather than a decisive offensive. The army marched north into Galilee, pillaging and burning Muslim villages, seizing some livestock, and probing the defenses of the Ayyubid forces without engaging in any major battle. They camped on Mount Tabor, the mountain associated with the Transfiguration of Christ, and looked out over the biblical landscape: the Jordan Valley, the Sea of Galilee, the distant heights of the Golan. They were in the Holy Land, on sacred ground, but they were not yet fighting for it in any meaningful sense. The raids achieved little of strategic value. Al-Adil, the Sultan, chose not to offer pitched battle, and his commanders retreated before the crusading army, avoiding any engagement that might have energized the Christian forces. The Muslims burned their own crops and forage ahead of the Crusaders' advance, making it difficult to sustain the army in the field for extended periods. The stalemate was frustrating. King Andrew of Hungary, who had never been entirely enthusiastic about the crusade beyond the discharge of his vow, began to find reasons to go home. His treasury was exhausted, his nobles were restless, and he had been away from his kingdom for months. In January 1218, Andrew departed for home, sailing from Acre with his Hungarian army and leaving the crusade to others. His departure was a significant blow to the prestige of the expedition, but it also cleared the way for a new phase, one that would be bolder, more aggressive, and more genuinely dangerous to the Muslims. Leopold of Austria remained. The military orders remained. The local barons of the Crusader kingdom remained. And from the west, new waves of crusaders were already sailing toward the Holy Land. Chapter 5. The fleet from the west, FRSANS, Dutch, and Northern Europeans. In the spring of 1218, a large fleet arrived at Acre that would fundamentally change the character of the crusade. It had sailed from the ports of the Rhine Delta and the North Sea, from Frisia, Holland, and other northern European territories, and it carried several thousand crusaders of a very different social type from the great lords and knights who had dominated the first wave. These were men of the middling sort: burghers, merchants, craftsmen, minor knights, clergy, and a sprinkling of nobles of modest rank. They had been recruited by the preaching campaigns organized under Innocent III's bull Quia Mayor, men who had taken the cross at outdoor sermons, in market squares and town churches, moved by the words of traveling preachers who painted the fall of Jerusalem in the most lurid and heartbreaking terms and promised spiritual rewards, plenary indulgences, the remission of sins, the guarantee of a place in heaven to all who answered the call. The Frisians and their allies were tough, practical, and motivated. They were also equipped with something the Crusade had been lacking: ships, good ships. The kind of ships that could carry men and supplies along a coast, that could be fitted with siege equipment, that could dominate a harbor. The naval dimension of the Fifth Crusade, which would be crucial in the coming siege, would be supplied largely by these northern European maritime communities. With the arrival of the Western Fleet, the commanders of the Crusade gathered once more in Acre and made a fateful decision. They would sail for Egypt. They would attack Damietta. The decision was taken in late May 1218. The army embarked, the fleet set sail, and the Fifth Crusade entered its decisive phase. Chapter 6: The Arrival at Damietta, Summer 1218. The fleet carrying the crusading army arrived off the Egyptian coast at the beginning of June 1218. What they saw before them was both impressive and daunting. Damietta sat on the eastern bank of the Nile, a few miles from the sea. It was a city of considerable size, large enough to house tens of thousands of inhabitants, surrounded by massive stone walls reinforced at intervals by towers. The walls extended down to the riverbank on both sides, so that the city could be supplied by water even if surrounded by land. In the river itself, opposite the city, sat a small island on which stood a massive tower, the Chain Tower, as the Crusaders would come to call it, from which a great iron chain stretched to the western bank, blocking all river traffic into the city. Any naval attack on Damietta would have to first neutralize this tower and break this chain. The Egyptian army, commanded by the Sultan's son Al-Kamel, was drawn up on the western bank of the Nile, watching the Christian fleet arrive. Al-Kamel had been alerted to the Crusaders' approach and had made preparations to defend the crossing, but he had not been able to prevent the landing. The Crusaders established a camp on the beach, unloaded their supplies and equipment, and began the complex business of organizing a siege. The immediate military problem was the Chain Tower. So long as it stood, the Crusaders could not bring their fleet up the Nile to cut off Damietta from the west. Without that naval blockade, the city could be reinforced and resupplied indefinitely, and the siege would be pointless. The assault on the Chain Tower took place on August 24, 1218, and it was one of the most remarkable feats of engineering and courage of the entire crusading era. The problem was that the tower sat in the middle of the river, surrounded by water, with walls rising directly from the surface. A conventional land assault was impossible. The Crusaders needed to attack from boats, and they needed to get their men up and over walls that rose 20 or 30 feet above the waterline. The solution was devised by the Frisians and their Dutch allies, who were experienced sailors and practical engineers. They took two of their largest ships and lashed them together side by side, creating a stable double-hulled platform. On the prow of this double ship, they constructed a tall wooden tower, a kind of movable fortification, that could be swung out over an enemy wall on a system of ropes and pulleys, creating a bridge from which attackers could leap onto the battlements. The assault was launched on a hot August morning. The double ship was rowed into position against the Chain Tower, while other vessels kept up a barrage of arrows and crossbow bolts to suppress the defenders. The wooden tower was swung into position. Men scrambled up the structure and threw themselves across the gap onto the tower's walls. The fighting was desperate and bloody. The defenders threw down stones and shot arrows and poured burning liquids on the attackers. Men fell into the river and drowned, but the Crusaders held on, fighting hand to hand on the narrow battlements, and gradually the weight of numbers told. The defenders were overwhelmed. The chain tower fell. The chain was broken, the river was open, and the Crusaders' fleet sailed up the Nile to take position on the western bank, cutting Damietta off by water as well as by land. The city was now surrounded. It was a moment of genuine triumph, and it inspired a wave of enthusiasm among the crusading host. But the real test, the siege of Damietta itself, was only just beginning. Chapter 7. The Siege of Damietta, Disease, Death, and Determination, 1218–1219. The Siege of Damietta would last 18 months. It was one of the longest, most grueling, and most costly sieges of the medieval period. A test of endurance that would kill thousands of crusaders, reshape the leadership of the expedition, and ultimately produce both a great triumph and the seeds of an even greater disaster. The city was formidably defended. Its walls were thick and well-maintained. Its garrison was large and well-supplied, at least initially. And Al-Kamal's army on the western bank of the Nile posed a constant threat. The Sultan could not break through the Crusaders' defenses, but he could keep them under pressure, launch raids, and prevent them from foraging too freely in the surrounding countryside. The Crusaders had established their main camp on the eastern bank of the Nile, between the river and the sea. It was not an ideal position. The ground was low and marshy in places, and when the Nile flooded, as it did every year with the regularity of a clock, swollen by the rains of equatorial Africa, large parts of the camp became waterlogged and disease-ridden. The Egyptian summer was brutal, temperatures that Europeans had never experienced, a dry heat that cracked lips and dehydrated men within hours, followed by periods of intense humidity as the Nile flood began. Disease was the great killer of medieval sieges, and it struck the crusading camp with particular ferocity in the autumn and winter of 1218. The combination of contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, heat, exhaustion, and the shock of an unfamiliar climate created conditions in which dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and other diseases could flourish. Men who had survived the voyage and the initial fighting died in their tents of fevers they could neither name nor treat. The camp's surgeons and physicians, whose medical knowledge was, by modern standards, almost entirely useless, could do little more than keep the sick comfortable while the diseases ran their course. Among the victims was the papal legate Pelagius himself, or rather, Pelagius fell seriously ill but recovered, which perhaps only strengthened his conviction that God intended him to complete the crusade. Others were not so fortunate. The sick lists grew longer, the camp became crowded with men too weak to fight, and morale fluctuated between desperate determination and near despair. The arrival of Cardinal Pelagius at Damietta in September 1218 added a new and combustible element to the command structure. Pelagius came with clear instructions from Honorius III. As papal legate, he was to provide spiritual leadership and moral authority to the crusade. But Pelagius interpreted his role more broadly than that. He saw himself as the supreme commander, not in the battlefield sense, but in the strategic sense. It was he, as the Pope's representative, who should determine the overall direction of the campaign. This put him in immediate tension with John of Brienne, the King of Jerusalem, who had his own views on strategy and his own claims to authority as the leading secular ruler of the crusading states. It also put him in tension with the leaders of the military orders, who were experienced soldiers with strong opinions about how sieges should be conducted. The tensions were managed, most of the time, through the mechanisms of collective decision-making, councils of war where the leaders debated their options and tried to reach consensus. But the seeds of future conflict were already planted. Despite the disease and the internal tensions, the siege made progress. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1218–1219, the Crusaders steadily tightened their grip on Damietta. Catapults and trebuchets were built and brought into action, battering sections of the city's walls. Attempts were made to undermine the foundations. A series of smaller towers and outposts were captured, bringing the besiegers' lines ever closer to the main walls. Al-Kamil, watching from the western bank, tried several times to break the siege. He launched attacks on the Crusaders' camp, attempting to overwhelm their defenses. He sent ships down the Nile in an attempt to break the naval blockade. He tried to interrupt the Crusaders' supply lines. All these efforts failed. The Crusaders' camp was well fortified, their fleet was too strong to be dislodged, and their determination to hold on was remarkable. In the early months of 1219, a crisis struck that had nothing to do with the Crusaders. A conspiracy within the Egyptian court threatened to overthrow Al-Kamil himself. The details are murky. Muslim sources are more informative than Christian ones here, but it appears that a faction among Al-Kamil's emirs, led by his own viceroy, attempted to seize power, either in favor of another member of the Ayyubid family or in pursuit of their own ambitions. Al-Kamil was forced to retreat with his army southward, abandoning his camp opposite Damietta. For several days, the Egyptian army was in disarray. The camp was empty, and the Crusaders looked across the river at an extraordinary opportunity. They could have crossed the Nile, advanced on the abandoned Egyptian camp, and perhaps rolled up the entire defense of Egypt in a single bold stroke. They did not. The reasons for this failure are disputed. John of Brienne and others later claimed that they had urged a crossing and been overruled, while others insisted that the army was not ready, that the boats were insufficient, that the danger of a trap was too great. Whatever the reason, the moment passed. Al-Kamil stabilized his position, suppressed the conspiracy, and returned to his camp strengthened rather than weakened by having survived the crisis. It was the first great missed opportunity of the Fifth Crusade. It would not be the last. Chapter 8. The Peace Offer, Al-Kamil's remarkable proposition. In the spring of 1219, something extraordinary happened. Sultan Al-Kamil sent envoys to the Crusader camp with a peace offer. The offer was, by any reasonable military and political calculus, remarkable. Al-Kamil was prepared to hand over Jerusalem, the true cross, which Saladin had captured at Hattin, and virtually all the territory of the Old Kingdom of Jerusalem, including Bethlehem, Nazareth, and most of the cities of Palestine, in exchange for the Crusaders abandoning their siege of Damietta and withdrawing from Egypt. Let that sink in for a moment. The Sultan of Egypt was offering to give the Crusaders everything they said they wanted, the holy city, the holy relic, the holy land, in exchange for going home. The offer reached the Crusader camp and immediately triggered a furious debate. The secular leaders, John of Brienne, the barons of the Crusader kingdom, most of the European nobles, were inclined to accept. Jerusalem was the stated goal of the crusade. If they could get it through negotiation rather than further bloodshed, why would they not? But Pelagius refused. His refusal was based on several arguments, some more persuasive than others. He argued first that Jerusalem without its fortifications, Al-Kamil had made clear that he would demolish the city walls as a condition of the transfer, to ensure that it could not become a military base, would be indefensible. The Ayyubid princes of Syria, who were Al-Kamil's rivals and had not been party to the offer, would simply ride in and retake the city at the first opportunity. Second, Pelagius argued that the Crusaders were winning. Damietta was about to fall. With Damietta in hand, they could dictate terms from a position of strength, terms that might include not just Jerusalem but the whole of Palestine, fortified and secure. Third, and perhaps most importantly for Pelagius himself, there was the prophecy. Somewhere in the Crusader camp, a document was circulating, possibly a letter from a mysterious Eastern Christian figure, possibly something of purely Western invention, that predicted the imminent arrival of a great Christian king from the East, a sort of proto-Prester John figure, who would sweep down on the Muslims from behind and crush them in a pincer movement with the Crusaders. This figure was sometimes identified with the famous but entirely mythological Prester John, the supposed Christian king of a great Eastern empire. The document predicted that the Muslims would be utterly destroyed and that all of the Holy Land would be recaptured. Pelagius believed this, or at least allowed himself to believe it, because it confirmed what he wanted to believe, that God intended total victory, not compromise. To accept Al-Kamel's offer would be to accept less than God had promised. The secular leaders were not persuaded. John of Brienne continued to argue for acceptance. The masters of the military orders were divided. Long, bitter debates were held in the councils of war. In the end, Pelagius's view prevailed, partly because of his authority as papal legate, partly because many of the Crusaders genuinely did believe in the prophecy, and partly because the fall of Damietta seemed so close. Al-Kamel's offer was rejected. The war would continue. Chapter 9. The Fall of Damietta, November 1219. Damietta fell to the Crusaders on November 5, 1219. By that autumn, the city had been under siege for 17 months. Its garrison, which had begun at several thousand strong, had been decimated by disease, starvation, and the grinding attrition of the siege. The supply lines that should have kept the city fed and reinforced had been cut by the Crusaders' naval blockade. The Egyptian army on the western bank had been unable to break through the Crusaders' defenses to relieve the city. The end came not with a dramatic final assault but with an eerie discovery. A Crusader patrol probing the city's defenses one morning found that the walls were unmanned. The gates were unguarded. There was no resistance. They entered the city to find a scene of almost unimaginable horror. Damietta had been reduced to a charnel house. Of the population of perhaps 40 or 50,000 that had inhabited the city before the siege, only 3,000 remained alive, and most of those were barely alive, too weak to move, lying in the streets and houses amid the bodies of the dead. Disease, plague, dysentery, famine had killed more of Damietta's defenders than all the Crusaders' weapons combined. The city's streets were clogged with corpses. The stench was said to be unbearable. The surviving garrison surrendered without a fight. There was no fight left in them. The Crusaders entered Damietta in triumph. Church bells were rung. The mosques were reconsecrated as churches. A mass was sung in what had been the city's great mosque, now transformed, at least temporarily, into a cathedral. The Cardinal Pelagius processed through the city's streets in full regalia, giving thanks to God for the victory. It was undeniably a great triumph. Damietta was the key to Egypt, and Egypt was the key to Jerusalem. The road to Cairo lay open. But the triumph immediately became the occasion for new quarrels. Who governed Damietta? Who got the revenues? Who controlled the property seized from the fleeing or dead Muslim inhabitants? These questions drove a wedge between Pelagius, who claimed authority in the name of the papacy, and John of Brienne, who claimed authority as king of Jerusalem and the leading secular crusader. The quarrel became so bitter that John of Brienne actually withdrew from the crusade for a period. He sailed north to Acre, supposedly to deal with matters in his kingdom, but in reality expressing his disgust at the way the campaign was being run. His departure left Pelagius as the dominant figure in Damietta, which was exactly what Pelagius wanted. Meanwhile, Al-Kamel continued his efforts to negotiate. He renewed his peace offer, still proposing to return Jerusalem. He was again rejected. Chapter 10. The Long Wait, Politics, Promises, and the Phantom Emperor, 1219–1221. After the fall of Damietta, the Fifth Crusade entered a long, strange period of stasis that would last for nearly 2 years. The stasis was caused, more than anything else, by the question of Frederick II. The Holy Roman Emperor had taken the cross in 1215 and had been promising to join the crusade ever since. Honorius III had been relying on Frederick's participation to provide the leadership and manpower that the crusade needed for its final push. Messages went back and forth between Damietta and the imperial court with tiresome regularity. Frederick was coming. Frederick was almost ready. Frederick had been delayed by affairs in Germany. Frederick needed more time to organize his fleet. In reality, Frederick had no intention of going anywhere until his domestic position in the empire was absolutely secure, and he had a genius for finding reasons why it was not yet secure enough. He was also, frankly, more interested in the politics of Sicily and southern Italy than in the liberation of Jerusalem. The crusade was important to him as a source of political legitimacy. Nothing could enhance an emperor's prestige more than a successful crusade, but he wanted to arrive after the difficult work was done, to sweep in at the head of a fresh army and claim the glory of final victory. The Crusaders at Damietta waited. They garrisoned the city, which was a depressing task. The streets still stank of the mass graves of the siege. The infrastructure was damaged, and maintaining a large army in an occupied city without the stimulus of active campaigning was a recipe for demoralization and desertion. Soldiers found their way to the wine shops that inevitably sprang up to serve an occupying force. Discipline deteriorated. The diverse nationalities and contingents of the crusading army developed their separate grievances and interests. Pelagius tried to maintain cohesion through exhortation and discipline. He was not always successful. He was a hard man to like, and his insistence on his own authority generated resentment among the secular leaders and the military orders alike. John of Brienne came and went, his relationship with Pelagius oscillating between cold coexistence and outright hostility. The masters of the Templars and Hospitallers attended councils, but increasingly did so with the air of men who had learned that their counsel would be ignored. Al-Kamil, for his part, used the breathing space to strengthen his position. He rebuilt his army, repaired his defenses, and continued his diplomatic efforts, not only with the Crusaders but with his Ayyubid relatives in Syria, trying to ensure that they would support rather than undermine his position if the war resumed. He also began work on a new series of fortifications along the Nile, making any advance toward Cairo more difficult. The prophecy of the Eastern Christian king continued to circulate in the Crusader camp, keeping alive the hope that help would come from an unexpected direction. In reality, the great Mongol conquests that would eventually reshape the entire Middle East were already beginning under Genghis Khan, and the tremors of this transformation were reaching the ears of Western Europeans in distorted and fantastic forms. The Mongols were confused with various legendary Christian kings. Their devastating campaigns against Muslim Central Asia were interpreted as the fulfillment of prophecy, and the hope persisted that somewhere out there, a great Christian army was advancing to the rescue. It was all fantasy, but it was a fantasy that made it easier to reject Al-Kamil's continued peace offers and to wait for Frederick, and to believe that the greatest triumph was just around the corner. Chapter 11, St. Francis in the Camp, a remarkable interlude. In the late summer of 1219, as the siege of Damietta was entering its final weeks, an extraordinary visitor arrived in the Crusader camp. Francis of Assisi was 37 years old, thin as a rail, dressed in a rough woolen habit, barefoot in the Egyptian summer, and entirely without fear. He had founded his order of friars barely a decade earlier, had received papal approval from Innocent III in 1210, and was already known across Italy as a man of remarkable holiness. A man who preached to birds, who embraced lepers, who had renounced the comfortable merchant background of his family to live in absolute poverty in imitation of Christ. Francis had come to Damietta for a specific purpose. He wanted to convert the Sultan. This was not, by the conventions of the time, quite as absurd as it sounds. Christian missionaries had occasionally penetrated Muslim courts before, and the tradition of religious disputation, of learned men debating theology before a powerful ruler who would then make his judgment, was a recognized genre in both the Islamic and Christian worlds. Francis's approach was different from learned disputation, however. He intended simply to proclaim the truth of Christ's gospel and to trust that its divine power would overcome the Sultan's resistance. Francis crossed the lines between the two armies. How exactly he accomplished this feat in the middle of a siege is unclear, but he apparently approached the Egyptian lines without weapons and was brought before Al-Kamil rather than simply being killed, which was the more usual fate of unarmed men who blundered into the middle of a war. Al-Kamil received him with courtesy. The Sultan was, as we have noted, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, and he found Francis interesting. The two men talked through interpreters for several days. Francis preached the gospel. Al-Kamil listened politely. He did not convert, but he did not execute Francis either, which he could perfectly legitimately have done. Instead, he gave Francis gifts, which Francis refused, and sent him safely back to the Crusader lines. The encounter has fascinated historians and hagiographers ever since, precisely because it represents something so different from the normal violent logic of the Crusades. Two men of genuine faith, from opposite sides of a bloody war, finding in each other a human being worth talking to. It changed nothing, of course. The war continued, but it stands as a reminder that the crusading era was not entirely defined by its violence. Francis left Egypt disillusioned by the crusade, but unchanged in his mission. He would go on to become one of the most beloved saints of the Christian tradition. Al-Kamil would go on to face the most dangerous phase of the crusade. Chapter 12. The advance on Cairo, Pride before the fall-summer 1221. By the spring of 1221, the patience of the Crusader leadership had finally snapped. Frederick II had sent word again that he was coming, that a great imperial fleet was being prepared, that his arrival would transform the situation. Pelagius, either believing this or choosing to believe it, argued for waiting. But the secular leaders, John of Brienne, who had returned to the camp, and the leaders of the arriving contingents from France and Germany were tired of waiting. The army was restless, the soldiers were demoralized by inaction, and Al-Kamil's continuing fortification of the Nile Valley suggested that every month of delay made the advance more difficult. In the end, despite John of Brienne's clear reservations, Pelagius ordered the advance. The crusading army broke camp at Damietta and began marching south along the eastern bank of the Nile, toward Cairo. It was July 1221, the worst possible time to advance in Egypt. The Nile flood, the annual inundation that had defined Egyptian agriculture and civilization for millennia, typically began in July or August, rising throughout the summer until it peaked in October, submerging vast areas of the delta and the valley in shallow, muddy water. Any army caught in the Nile Valley during the inundation would find itself surrounded by water, cut off from retreat, unable to maneuver, and dependent on dwindling supplies in a flooded landscape. Every experienced person in the Crusader camp knew this. John of Brienne knew it. The masters of the military orders knew it. The local barons who had spent their lives on the edge of the Egyptian frontier certainly knew it. They warned against advancing in summer. They urged delay until the autumn when the flood would recede. Pelagius overrode their objections. God had promised victory. Frederick's fleet was coming with reinforcements. The advance would succeed because it must succeed. The army marched south. It was an impressive force, estimates vary, but something in the range of 40,000 to 50,000 men, including a large cavalry contingent and an extensive supply train. The fleet sailed down the Nile alongside the land force, carrying supplies and providing a mobile base. Initially, the advance went well. The Egyptian defenses fell back before them. The great fortress of Tanis was evacuated without a fight. The army made good progress, covering the miles between Damietta and the Egyptian interior at a steady pace. But then Al-Kamel implemented a strategy that the Crusaders, in their haste and overconfidence, had failed to anticipate. He opened the sluice gates. The network of irrigation canals that crossed the Nile Delta was controlled by a system of earthen dams and sluice gates that had been maintained and improved by Egyptian engineers for centuries. By opening these gates at the right moment, Al-Kamel could direct the rising Nile waters across the land, flooding the terrain through which the Crusaders were marching. The water rose with alarming speed. What had been firm agricultural land became shallow marsh, then ankle-deep water, then knee-deep mud. The Crusaders' supply wagons bogged down. The cavalry horses floundered. The infantry struggled forward through clinging mud, their heavy armor dragging at them, their boots filled with water. At the same time, the Egyptian army, which had been retreating, turned and attacked. Al-Kamel's forces moved up the Nile by boat, cutting off the Crusaders' supply line and threatening their retreat route. Egyptian cavalry swept around the flanks of the bogged-down Crusader army. The situation deteriorated from difficult to desperate within days. John of Brienne and the other secular leaders urged an immediate retreat before the trap closed completely. Pelagius resisted, still clinging to his certainty of divine favor, still expecting Frederick's fleet to appear around the next bend in the river. The fleet did not appear. Frederick was in Italy making yet more preparations. The retreat, when it finally began, was a catastrophe. The army struggled back northward through the flooded terrain, harassed constantly by Egyptian cavalry and archers. Men who fell behind were cut down. Supply wagons were abandoned. Equipment was thrown away to lighten the load. The army that had marched south in order and high spirits staggered back toward Damietta in fragments, exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. Al-Kamel, showing the same quality of magnanimous restraint that had characterized his conduct throughout the campaign, chose not to annihilate the retreating Crusaders when he had the opportunity. Instead, he sent envoys offering terms. The Crusaders were to return Damietta and leave Egypt. In exchange, they would be allowed to depart in peace with an 8-year truce. On September 8, 1221, the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, the Crusader leaders agreed to Al-Kamel's terms. Damietta was surrendered. The crusading army sailed away from Egypt, leaving behind the city that had cost them so much blood, so much time, and so much hope. The Fifth Crusade was over. Chapter 13. The Reckoning. Why did the Fifth Crusade fail? In the immediate aftermath of the Fifth Crusade's collapse, the question on every tongue in Europe was the same. Why? How had a crusade that had seized the key to Egypt, that had held Jerusalem within its grasp through Al-Kamel's repeated peace offers, that had marched within striking distance of Cairo itself, how had such a crusade ended in abject failure? The blame was assigned quickly and, in most quarters, to Pelagius. The cardinal legate was the obvious target. He had overridden the military judgment of experienced commanders. He had rejected the peace offers. He had ordered the advance in summer, and his stubborn refusal to retreat until it was almost too late had come close to resulting in the total destruction of the army rather than merely its humiliation. Pelagius defended himself vigorously. He argued that he had been right to reject Al-Kamel's offers because Jerusalem without walls was indefensible. He argued that the decision to advance had been collective, not his alone. He argued that if Frederick II had arrived as promised, the advance would have succeeded. He was not wrong on all points. Frederick's failure to appear was a genuine betrayal of the crusade, and the emperor bore real responsibility for its failure. The walls of Jerusalem argument had some validity too. There were thoughtful people who agreed that an unfortified Jerusalem would be impossible to hold. But the deepest failure was not one of strategy or timing. It was a failure of judgment rooted in a failure of imagination. Pelagius could not imagine that God's will and the logic of compromise might coincide, that accepting less than total victory might be the wisest course. He was not alone in this. Medieval crusading ideology had always been uncomfortable with negotiated outcomes, always suspicious that any peace with Muslims was a betrayal of Christian duty. Pelagius was the product of that ideology, carried to its logical extreme. The secular leaders, John of Brienne, the military orders, the barons of Outremer, showed better strategic judgment. They understood Egypt's geography. They understood the risks of advancing in summer. They were willing to take what Al-Kamil was offering. But they lacked the authority, in the end, to overrule the papal legate. And the crusading movement's combination of spiritual and military authority in the same expedition created conditions in which the spiritual authority, Pelagius, could override the military authority, John of Brienne, with disastrous results. There was also the problem of unity of command. The Fifth Crusade suffered from a fragmented leadership from beginning to end, multiple contingents from different countries with different interests, arriving at different times, answering to different authorities, with no single clear commander who could coordinate them effectively. The military orders had their own institutional loyalties. The secular nobles had their own political calculations. The papal legate had his vision of divine mandate. In such conditions, achieving consensus was nearly impossible, and the failure to achieve it at critical moments, particularly at the moment of Al-Kamil's first peace offer, proved fatal. Finally, there was the problem of what we might call ideological self-deception. The prophecy of the Eastern King, which was almost certainly a forgery or at best a wild speculation, distorted strategic thinking throughout the crusade. It made rejection of reasonable peace terms seem like an act of faith rather than an act of folly. It kept alive hopes that had no basis in reality. It was the medieval equivalent of wishful intelligence. Chapter 14. The World After the Fifth Crusade, CONSEQNCES and LEGACIS. The failure of the Fifth Crusade had profound and lasting consequences for the history of the crusading movement and the medieval Middle East. In the immediate term, it left the Crusader states of the Eastern Mediterranean in a weakened position. The truce with Al-Kamil gave them 8 years of peace, which was something, but it did nothing to restore the territory they had lost, and it left Jerusalem still in Muslim hands. The loss of Damietta, which had been won at such cost, was felt as a particularly bitter blow. It had been the greatest prize the Crusaders had taken since Acre in 1191, and to give it back without condition was a humiliation that the memory of the whole venture could not overcome. For the papacy, the failure was a serious blow to the credibility of its crusading program. Innocent III's vision of a papally led, universally supported, perfectly organized crusade had been put to the test and had failed. The lessons were drawn in different ways by different people, but they contributed to a growing disillusionment with the crusading ideal, a sense that God was not, after all, guaranteeing success to his faithful warriors, and that the combination of spiritual authority and military command might not be the winning formula it appeared. For Frederick II, the failure was both embarrassing and politically useful. Embarrassing because his non-appearance had demonstrably harmed the crusade and given his enemies grounds to accuse him of betraying Christendom. Useful because the failure of others meant that he now had an opportunity to succeed where they had failed, to go to the Holy Land himself, without the baggage of the Fifth Crusade's mismanagement, and achieve what all the Crusaders before him had been unable to. And indeed, in 1229, Frederick would go to the Holy Land, not as a crusader in the conventional sense, but as a diplomat. He negotiated with Al-Kamil, the same sultan who had offered Jerusalem to the Fifth Crusade, and secured exactly what Pelagius had refused: the return of Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the sea. Frederick was excommunicated at the time of his negotiations. Honorius's successor Gregory IX had lost patience with his endless delays, which made the whole episode even more surreal. A crusade led by an excommunicated emperor, negotiating with a Muslim sultan, recovering the holy city without a battle. The clergy of Jerusalem were so horrified that they imposed an interdict on the city when Frederick entered it, refusing to celebrate Mass in his presence. It was, in its way, the ultimate irony of the Fifth Crusade. The goal that Pelagius had refused to accept through negotiation was achieved through negotiation just 8 years later by the emperor whose absence had doomed the crusade to failure. For the Ayyubid world, the Fifth Crusade had demonstrated both the military resilience of Muslim Egypt and the strategic vulnerability that came from internal divisions. Al-Kamil had managed the crisis with remarkable skill, containing the Crusaders in Damietta, weathering the internal conspiracy that had nearly unseated him, conducting a sophisticated defensive campaign, and finally using geography and timing to trap the advancing Crusader army. His willingness to offer Jerusalem repeatedly and to accept the return of Damietta as a satisfactory outcome showed a strategic maturity that his opponents singularly lacked. Al-Kamil would rule Egypt until 1238. His long reign saw a period of relative stability and prosperity for his country, and his relationship with the Crusader states remained defined by the pragmatic diplomacy he had demonstrated during the Fifth Crusade. For the broader history of the medieval world, the Fifth Crusade is significant in ways that go beyond its immediate military and political outcomes. It represents a turning point in the history of crusading, the moment when the ideal of the universally supported, papally directed crusade began to fracture under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Later crusades would be smaller, more focused, more often than not led by individual monarchs pursuing their own political agendas under a crusading banner. The great vision of innocent III, all of Christendom united in the service of God's holy war, was never quite achieved again after 1221. Chapter 15. The Soldiers and the Saints, Human Stories of the Fifth Crusade. We have spent much of this documentary looking at the great figures, the kings and cardinals, the sultans and strategists who shaped the Fifth Crusade. But the Crusade was also the experience of tens of thousands of ordinary people, and their stories deserve to be told. The Crusaders who sailed for Egypt in 1218 came from every part of Latin Christendom. They were French knights seeking glory and salvation. They were German merchants who had taken the cross at a Rhineland sermon and sold their businesses to fund the voyage. They were Flemish weavers and English clergymen and Italian sailors. They were Hungarian cavalry and Austrian infantry and Frisian oarsmen. They were pilgrims as much as soldiers, men and women, for there were women in the crusading army, including camp followers, nurses, and some of genuinely noble rank, who believed that they were participating in a divine drama, that their suffering and their courage would be weighed in heaven and found sufficient to remit the punishment due for a lifetime of sin. For many of them, the crusade was the defining experience of their lives. They had left behind everything familiar, home, family, occupation, country, to travel to a world of bewildering strangeness. The heat of the Egyptian summer was like nothing they had ever imagined. The food was different, the language was incomprehensible, the diseases were unknown. They watched friends and comrades die not in the glory of battle, but in the filth of the camp latrine, of fevers and dysentery, far from home, without the comfort of priests who spoke their language or friends who had known them as children. And yet they held on. Month after month, year after year of siege, they held on before Damietta, digging and building, fighting and dying, praying and cursing, maintaining the blockade through flood and fever. Whatever we think of the strategic decisions of their leaders, the ordinary crusaders of the Fifth Crusade showed a tenacity and endurance that is genuinely remarkable. Among the ranks of these thousands, a few individual voices come down to us through the documents. We have the Chronicle of Oliver of Paderborn, a German theologian who served as a preacher and chronicler throughout the campaign and left an invaluable account of events, written with the perspective of a highly educated observer who was nonetheless genuinely present at the events he described. We have letters sent home by crusaders, brief, sometimes barely literate, touching in their combination of piety, practicality, and homesickness. We have the records of the military orders, dry administrative documents that nonetheless preserve glimpses of the human reality behind the grand strategic narrative. From these sources we catch glimpses. A knight from Flanders who survived 18 months of siege only to die of fever 3 weeks after the fall of Damietta. A Frisian sailor who kept a remarkably detailed log of the fleet's activities, noting weather, tides, engagements, and the daily life of the camp, with the matter-of-fact precision of a man accustomed to recording practical information. A German bishop who wrote a long letter to his cathedral chapter describing the heat, the flies, the stench of the siege, and the extraordinary courage of the ordinary soldiers, in terms that make clear he was genuinely moved by what he witnessed. On the Egyptian side, too, there were ordinary people caught in the catastrophe, the civilians of Damietta who died in their thousands during the siege. The soldiers of Al-Kamal's army who faced the crusaders across the Nile, the merchants whose trade was disrupted, the farmers whose fields were flooded and burned. Their voices are even harder to hear through the documents, but they were there, and the Fifth Crusade was their story too. Chapter 16, Faith and Doubt, the spiritual dimensions of the Fifth Crusade. The Fifth Crusade was, at its core, a religious undertaking, not merely in the sense that it was organized and justified by the Church, but in the sense that the men and women who participated in it genuinely believed they were doing God's work, that the outcome of their efforts would be determined by the state of their souls as much as by the size of their armies. This belief shaped everything about the way the crusade was conducted. It is why Pelagius could reject militarily sound arguments for peace with the conviction that he was obeying a higher authority. It is why ordinary crusaders endured conditions that would seem, by purely rational calculation, to make continued effort pointless. It is why the fall of Damietta was greeted with religious ecstasy as well as military satisfaction, and why the eventual retreat was experienced not merely as a military defeat, but as a spiritual catastrophe, a sign of divine punishment for the sins of the crusading host. The theology of crusading had developed, by the early 13th century, into a fairly elaborate system. The crusader who took the cross was understood to be performing an act of penitential service, using his military skills in the service of God as a substitute for or supplement to the penitential disciplines of fasting, pilgrimage, and prayer. In exchange, he received the plenary indulgence, the remission of all the temporal punishment due for his sins. This was not a pardon for sin itself, which required confession and contrition, but a remission of the earthly and purgatorial consequences of sin. To die on crusade was, effectively, to die already spiritually cleansed. The crusader's soul went straight to heaven, bypassing purgatory. This theological framework gave the crusade an enormous psychological power. The men who signed up were not merely soldiers hired to fight a war. They were penitents performing a sacred act. Their suffering was not meaningless. It was spiritually valuable, part of the logic of penance, the pain that paid the debt of sin. This is why they could endure conditions that would have caused a purely secular army to mutiny and disperse. They were not simply enduring hardship. They were accumulating merit. But the same theology created problems when the crusade failed. If God had promised victory to his faithful warriors, and if the crusade had been defeated, the logical inference was that the crusaders had not been faithful enough. The defeat at the Nile was quickly interpreted by Pelagius and others as God's punishment for the sins of the crusading host. Their pride, their quarreling, their moral laxity in the occupied city of Damietta. The implication was that the crusaders themselves were to blame for their own defeat, not their commanders' strategic errors, not the inherent difficulty of the military problem, not the skill and determination of Al-Kamal, but their own sinfulness. This interpretation, whatever its theological merits, had the practical effect of preventing any clear-eyed analysis of what had actually gone wrong. It made learning from failure very difficult, because the lesson it offered, repent more, sin less, was not one that had obvious strategic applications. And yet there were voices, in the aftermath of the Fifth Crusade, that began to ask harder questions. Jacques de Vitry, the Bishop of Acre who had preached the crusade with great energy and participated in it with great courage, came away from the experience with a complex and troubled mind. He continued to believe in the crusading ideal, but his letters from the period reflect a growing awareness of the gap between the ideal and the reality, between the vision of a holy army purified by suffering and the actual behavior of the men in the camp, who were as capable of greed, lust, cowardice, and pride as any other collection of human beings. He wrote about the moral failures of the crusading host with an honesty that was unusual for the genre, and his reflections point toward a more searching examination of the crusading enterprise than most of his contemporaries were willing to undertake. Chapter 17: The Legacy of the Fifth Crusade in History and Memory. How has history remembered the Fifth Crusade? For centuries after its conclusion, the Fifth Crusade was primarily remembered as a cautionary tale, specifically as a story about the dangers of clerical overreach in military matters and about the folly of rejecting reasonable peace terms in the pursuit of total victory. Medieval and later chroniclers fixed on the figure of Pelagius as the villain of the peace, the proud, inflexible cardinal who had thrown away Jerusalem for the sake of his own authority. This verdict was not entirely unfair, but it was simplistic, and it tended to obscure the genuine complexity of the decisions that had been made and the genuine constraints under which all the participants had operated. Modern historians have been somewhat kinder to Pelagius, or at least more understanding of his position. They have pointed out that the structural problems of the Fifth Crusade, the divided command, the absent emperor, the difficulty of operating deep in enemy territory, were not of his making, and that his strategic arguments, while ultimately wrong, were not irrational. They have also given more credit to the military skill and diplomatic sophistication of Al-Kamil, whose handling of the crisis has been recognized as a genuinely impressive achievement. The Fifth Crusade occupies an interesting place in the broader history of the crusading movement. It came at a pivot point, after the relative successes of the First and Third Crusades and the catastrophes of the Second and Fourth. It represented the most systematic and well-planned attempt yet to translate crusading ideology into effective military action. That it failed, despite its systematic planning, despite the fall of Damietta, despite the multiple opportunities for success. This failure was a profound disappointment, and it contributed to the slow erosion of the crusading ideal that would continue throughout the 13th century. The Fifth Crusade also contributed, indirectly, to one of the most extraordinary episodes of the later crusading era, the negotiations of Frederick II in 1229. The willingness of Al-Kamil to offer Jerusalem to the Fifth Crusaders and the refusal of Pelagius to accept established a precedent for diplomatic engagement that Frederick was able to exploit. The very experience of the Fifth Crusade, its failure, its specific failures, shaped the conditions that made Frederick's diplomatic crusade possible. In the long run, the Fifth Crusade is significant not because it succeeded, but because of what it reveals about the crusading movement at a critical moment in its development. Its ambitions and its limitations, its idealism and its internal contradictions, its capacity for remarkable courage, and its capacity for catastrophic misjudgment. It is a story that tells us as much about medieval Europe, about how it thought, how it organized itself, what it believed, what it feared, as it tells us about the Middle East. And it is a story that, in its human dimensions, continues to resonate. The ordinary crusaders who endured the siege of Damietta, who died of fever in the Egyptian summer, who trudged back through the flooded Nile Delta in the autumn of 1221, These men and women were not so different from ordinary people in other times who have been caught up in great historical events not of their making, who have been asked to sacrifice for causes larger than themselves, and who have done so with a mixture of faith, fear, endurance, and the simple human desire to go home. Chapter 18. The broader crusading context, Parallels and Pattrns. The Fifth Crusade did not exist in isolation. To understand it fully, we need to place it in the broader pattern of the crusading movement, to see what it shared with its predecessors and successors, and what made it distinctive. Every crusade faced the fundamental problem of mobilizing a coalition of forces from different countries, with different interests, under a divided command structure that combined secular and ecclesiastical authority in ways that were inherently unstable. The First Crusade had managed this through a combination of extraordinary circumstances and collective momentum. The subsequent crusades struggled with it in different ways. The Fifth Crusade's decision to target Egypt rather than Palestine was not unique, as we have seen. It had been contemplated since the 12th century, but the Fifth Crusade was the most serious and systematic attempt to implement the Egypt strategy, and its failure would not deter later crusaders from trying the same approach. Louis IX of France would lead the Seventh Crusade to Damietta in 1249, following almost exactly the same route as the Fifth Crusade, achieving almost exactly the same initial success, and suffering almost exactly the same eventual disaster when his army was trapped by the Nile floods and forced to surrender. The lessons of the Fifth Crusade, it seems, were not easily absorbed. The pattern of rejected peace offers is also worth noting in the broader context. Throughout the crusading era, Muslim rulers periodically offered terms that would have given the Crusaders much of what they claimed to want, in exchange for peace. These offers were usually rejected, for a combination of reasons: the belief that God promised total victory, the fear that partial gains would be temporary, the suspicion that any deal with Muslims was a trap or a betrayal, and the political difficulty of selling a compromise peace to constituencies in Europe who had been sold a vision of total triumph. The repeated rejection of Al-Kamil's offers during the Fifth Crusade is perhaps the most dramatic example of this pattern, but it is not an isolated one. The role of the papacy in the Fifth Crusade, attempting to direct a military campaign through a combination of spiritual authority, financial organization, and direct legatine representation, was an experiment that yielded deeply ambiguous results. The organization was impressive, but the combination of spiritual and military authority in the person of Pelagius created exactly the kind of command confusion that military campaigns cannot afford. Later popes would continue to try to exercise strategic direction over crusades, but the failure of Pelagius's leadership contributed to a gradual shift toward allowing secular rulers more operational control, while the papacy concentrated on organization and finance. Chapter 19. Damietta's Afterlife: What Happened Next? After the Crusaders sailed away in September 1221, Damietta was returned to Egyptian rule. Al-Kamil ordered the city's fortifications to be partially dismantled and its harbor facilities to be modified to prevent any future naval assault of the kind the Crusaders had launched in 1218. The city itself recovered relatively quickly from the devastation of the siege. Egyptian engineers repaired the walls and infrastructure. New settlers arrived to replace the population that had died or fled, and within a few years, Damietta was once again a functioning port city, handling the trade of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Christian community that had briefly established itself in the city, the churches that had been created from mosques, the Latin clergy who had celebrated Mass in the shadow of the minarets, disappeared entirely. The mosques were reconsecrated, the Latin clerics departed, and Damietta returned to its Muslim character. But the memory of the siege lingered in both communities. In Europe, Damietta became a byword for both potential and failure, the greatest prize of the Fifth Crusade, won and lost. In the Islamic world, the defense and recovery of Damietta was remembered as a triumph of resilience, a victory won not through a single glorious battle, but through the patient, determined application of superior knowledge of the land, the river, and the season. When Louis Ix arrived before Damietta 30 years later, the parallels were so close as to be almost eerie. The same city, the same approach, the same initial success, and ultimately the same catastrophic failure in the face of the Nile floods. History was not merely repeating itself. The French had studied the Fifth Crusade, had tried to learn its lessons, had attempted to improve on its methods. And yet the fundamental problem, an army from the temperate north trying to fight a war in the Egyptian summer, proved as intractable in 1250 as it had been in 1221. Chapter 20. Conclusion: the meaning of the Fifth Crusade. We have come a long way, my friend, in this journey through the Fifth Crusade. We have traveled from the courts of Europe, where innocent III and honorious III dreamed their dreams of holy war, to the beaches of Damietta, where Frisian sailors built their siege tower from two lashed-together ships. We have sat in the command tents where Pelagius and John of Brienne argued strategy through long Egyptian nights. We have watched Francis of Assisi walk barefoot across a battlefield to talk theology with a sultan. We have seen the walls of Damietta fall and the army of the Crusade march toward Cairo with hope in their hearts. And we have watched that army stagger back through the mud of a flooded delta with nothing to show for years of sacrifice. What does it all mean? The Fifth Crusade is, among other things, a story about the limits of certainty. Pelagius was certain, absolutely, unshakably certain, that God intended total victory, that to accept compromise was to betray divine will. This certainty was his greatest strength and his most catastrophic flaw. It gave him the determination to hold the crusade together through months of hardship and internal conflict. It also made it impossible for him to recognize an opportunity when it was placed directly in his hands. Al-Kamil, by contrast, was a man comfortable with uncertainty. He knew he might not be able to defeat the Crusaders militarily. He knew his internal position was vulnerable. He was willing to negotiate, to offer more than he strictly had to accept outcomes that were less than total victory, because he understood that in the real world, total victory was rare, and compromise was often the difference between losing everything and retaining what mattered most. His pragmatism was ultimately vindicated, not triumphantly, but sufficiently. The Fifth Crusade is also a story about the relationship between ideology and reality. The crusading ideology was powerful and genuine, rooted in deep convictions about sin, salvation, and the sacred geography of the Holy Land. But it was also, when taken to its extreme, a lens that distorted rather than clarified reality. It made the Crusaders see what they wanted to see: divine promises, prophesied victories, miraculous interventions just around the corner, rather than what was actually there. A strong, well-led Egyptian army, a flooded landscape, an advancing summer, and a peace offer that was the best deal they were ever likely to get. And it is a story about the persistence of hope in the face of evidence. The Crusaders of the Fifth Crusade did not give up easily. They endured conditions that would have broken most armies. They held on through disease and division, through the long months of siege and the long months of waiting, through military setbacks and command quarrels. Their faith was, in many respects, remarkable. It simply was not enough to overcome the combined weight of geographical reality, strategic error, and the skill of their opponents. In the end, the Fifth Crusade achieved nothing that lasted. Jerusalem was not recovered. The Crusader states were no more secure than before. Damietta was given back. The sacrifices of the thousands who had died in the Egyptian summer were, in the narrowest accounting, for nothing. And yet to say that alone would be insufficient. The Fifth Crusade is part of a human story that is not simply about success and failure. It is about what happens when people of deep conviction attempt to translate their beliefs into action in a complex world. It is about the difficulty of coalition and command. It is about the human capacity for both extraordinary endurance and catastrophic misjudgment. It is about the gap between the world as we believe it should be and the world as it is. These are not merely medieval themes, they are permanent ones. We are here, my friend, at the end of a long journey. The sun sets over the Nile, as it set over the Crusaders' camp in 1218, in 1219, in 1221. The waters rise and fall as they always have, indifferent to the ambitions of the men who marched beside them. The city of Damietta still stands, changed beyond all recognition from the fortified medieval port that the Crusaders besieged, but still at the mouth of that eastern branch of the Nile, still standing where the river meets the sea. The Fifth Crusade is over, but its questions remain, about faith and judgment, about certainty and compromise, about the price of conviction and the cost of hubris. They are questions that history keeps asking in different forms in different ages, and for which history provides not answers but examples of what happens when we get it right, and what happens when we don't. Thank you for traveling with me tonight through these 8 centuries of history. Until next time, good night. Epilogue: The Long Shadow, from 1221 the end of the Crusading era. The Fifth Crusade ended in 1221, but the crusading movement it was part of would continue for another quarter century before the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, the city of Acre, fell to the Mamluks in 1291. These 7 decades saw remarkable episodes. Frederick II's diplomatic recovery of Jerusalem in 1229, the brief flowering of a restored Jerusalem that was then lost again in 1244, the 7th and 8th Crusades of Louis IX of France, and the gradual military decline of the Crusader states as they were ground down by the rising power of the Mamluk Sultanate. But the Fifth Crusade cast a long shadow over all of these events. Its failure had demonstrated, with painful clarity, the internal contradictions of the crusading enterprise, the incompatibility of unified military command with the divided authority structure that the papacy insisted on maintaining, the impossibility of fighting a long campaign in Egypt with forces that arrived in waves and departed when their feudal obligations were complete, the fundamental difficulty of a strategy that required holding objectives thousands of miles from the Crusaders' home territories. The later Crusades would attempt various solutions to these problems. Frederick II's Crusade of 1229 tried diplomacy instead of warfare. Louis IX's Crusades tried centralized royal command, eliminating the problem of papal secular conflict by making the King of France the unambiguous leader. None of these solutions proved sufficient. The Crusader states of the Eastern Mediterranean were ultimately doomed by the simple arithmetic of distance and resources. They were too far from Europe, too dependent on the intermittent support of rulers who had pressing concerns at home, too small to resist the consolidated power of the Egyptian sultans, once those sultans had eliminated their internal rivals and unified the Muslim world of the region. The Fifth Crusade was not the beginning of this doom, nor was it the cause of it. But it was, perhaps, the moment when the inner contradictions of the crusading movement became fully visible, when the gap between the ideal of holy war and the reality of medieval coalition warfare could no longer be bridged by faith alone. When the Mamluks took Acre in May 1291, the last great chapter of the crusading era in the Holy Land came to an end. The city fell after a siege of intense ferocity, and the surviving population, those who had not been killed or enslaved, fled to Cyprus and to the ships in the harbor. The Teutonic Knights, the Hospitallers, and the Templars, the great military orders whose predecessors had helped build and defend the Crusader states for 2 centuries, evacuated their headquarters and sailed away. The crusading ideal would survive in other forms in Spain, in the Baltic, in the continuing rhetoric of popes and preachers, but the specific project of the Crusades in the Holy Land was over. Damietta, the city that had cost the Fifth Crusade so much, outlasted them all. It stands today in modern Egypt, a regional city in the Nile Delta, its medieval walls long since replaced by modern buildings, its harbor still handling the traffic of the eastern Mediterranean. The chain tower that the Frisians stormed is gone. The mosques that were briefly converted to churches are gone. The great siege camp where the Crusaders prayed and fought and died is buried under centuries of silt and development. But the story remains. It remains in the chronicles that the Crusaders themselves wrote, in the letters they sent home, in the histories that Muslim scholars composed of the same events seen from the other side. It remains in the great surviving monuments of the medieval Middle East, the citadels and mosques and fortifications that were built or rebuilt during the Crusading era, the product of a century and a half of military, cultural, and commercial encounter between the Latin West and the Islamic East. And it remains in this telling, and in the telling of others who have tried, as we have tried tonight, to recover from the silence of 8 centuries, the voices and faces of the men and women who lived and died in the service of their faith, in the heat of the Egyptian sun, on the banks of the eternal Nile. SELECTED, further reading and historical notes. For those who wish to explore the Fifth Crusade and its context more deeply, the primary sources are rich and varied. Oliver of Paderborn's Historia Damietina is the most detailed eyewitness account from the Christian side, written by a man of intelligence and integrity who was present throughout much of the campaign. Jacques de Vitry's letters from the period provide a complementary perspective, particularly valuable for the spiritual and social dimensions of the Crusade. The Arabic sources, particularly the chronicles of Ibn al-Athir and the later accounts drawing on earlier Egyptian records, provide the Muslim perspective and are essential for understanding al-Kamil's strategy and the Egyptian experience of the siege. Among modern historians, James M. Powell's Anatomy of a Crusade remains the standard scholarly account of the Fifth Crusade in English, combining careful analysis of the primary sources with a sophisticated understanding of the social and institutional history of crusading. Thomas F. Madden's broader histories of the Crusades provide essential context. P. M. Holt's work on the age of the Crusades from the perspective of the Islamic world is invaluable for understanding the other side of the encounter. The figure of Pelagius has attracted considerable scholarly attention. His rehabilitation, or at least his rescue from the role of simple villain, has been an important theme in recent crusading scholarship, with historians like Powell emphasizing the structural constraints that shaped his decisions and the genuine strategic arguments that could be made for his positions. The encounter between Francis of Assisi and Al-Kamil has generated its own substantial literature, including John V. Tollan's comprehensive study of the episode and its historical memory. This meeting continues to fascinate because it represents so strikingly the possibility of peaceful encounter amid the violence of the Crusades, a possibility that the larger history of the movement so rarely allowed to be realized. The broader question of why the Crusades ultimately failed, why the Crusader states could not be sustained indefinitely despite periodic reinforcement from Europe, continues to generate debate. The answers involve military geography, political structures, demography, economics, and cultural exchange, and the Fifth Crusade's evidence bears on all of them. History does not offer simple lessons, but it offers this: the story of human beings in extraordinary circumstances, making decisions with incomplete information, sustained by beliefs that were sometimes their greatest strength and sometimes their most dangerous weakness, and leaving behind, in their failures as much as in their successes, a record that continues to speak to us across the centuries. The Fifth Crusade speaks. We have tried tonight to listen.